All right, this is number 3, screencast for Unit 5, Lesson 3, and I'm on page 254. We're going to talk about what causes tidal cycles. All right, the rotation of the Earth and the Moon's revolution around Earth determine when tides occur. Okay? When you're facing the Moon or directly on the opposite side of the Earth, away from the Moon, you're having high tide. And when you're kind of turned 90 degrees from the Moon, those are low tide areas. Okay, so as the Earth rotates, you go from high tide, you turn about 90 degrees, now you're low tide, turn about 90 more degrees, high tide, low tide. So that's how the tidal cycle works. A place on Earth that is facing the Moon takes 24 hours and 50 minutes to rotate to face the Moon again. So the cycle of high tides and low tides at any place on Earth happens 50 minutes later each day because of that extra 50 minutes. Okay, the reason why you've got that extra 50 minutes is because while the Earth is rotating on its axis, remember that the Moon is also moving in its revolution around Earth. So when the Earth is turning 24 hours later, the Moon's not here anymore. It has moved. So that extra 50 minutes is the time required to then, rotate a little more to face the Moon again. So that's why you've got the 24 hours and 50 minutes. Okay? All right. So for instance, if I'm going to talk about where high tides and low tides are occurring, high tide would be here. Another high tide would be down here. Low tide would be at about 90 degrees and 90 degrees. Okay? All right, so what determines when tides occur? The rotation of the Earth and the Moon's revolution around the Earth. Okay? In many places, there are 2 high tides and 2 low tides each day. Because the tide cycle occurs in 24 hours and 50 minutes, it takes about 6 hours and 12 and a half minutes, 1/4 of that 24 hours and 50 minutes, for water in an area to go from high tide to low tide, because of the rotation of the Earth and the position of the Moon. Okay? It takes about 12 hours and 25 minutes, which is half of the total tidal cycle time, to go from high tide to the next high tide. Okay? All right, so an area on Earth would experience a high tide, then about 6 hours, 12 and a half minutes later, a low tide. That area, 6 hours, 12 and a half minutes later, another high tide. 6 hours, 12 and a half minutes later, another low tide, and then you've completed your tidal cycle, so the next high tide would be like part of the next cycle. Okay? So from high tide to low tide is 6 hours and 25 minutes. Draw a little bracket right here and put 6 hours, 12 and a half minutes. Okay? From low tide back to high tide would be another 6 hours, 12 and a half minutes. From high tide all the way to the next high tide is 12 hours and 25 minutes. Okay? Or low tide to the next low tide, 12 hours and 25 minutes. So draw a bracket from high tide to the next high tide and make sure that you put 12 hours and 25 minutes. Okay? Now, just remember, from the beginning of the tidal cycle here to the beginning of the next tidal cycle, that's 24 hours and 50 minutes. Okay? And remember that the extra 50 minutes is because the Moon is moving in its revolution around Earth as Earth is rotating on its axis. All right, so just to show you what I meant, 6 hours, 12 and a half minutes from high tide to low tide, another 6 hours, 12 and a half minutes from low tide back to high tide. And remember, to show me that you're listening, make sure you draw the bracket from high tide to the next high tide and label it 12 hours and 25 minutes. All right, join me at the bottom of the page and we're going to fill in the data table. All right, notice they have the high tide and low tide times, some of which we're going to have to fill in. And remember, the time it takes to go from high tide to low tide is 6 hours and 12 and a half minutes. Time it takes to go from low tide back to high tide is 6 hours, 12 and a half minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to alternate. We're going to start at high tide. This time I'm going to add 6 hours and 12 minutes and I come to 6:26 in the morning a.m. The next time I'm going to add 6 hours and 13 minutes, because remember it's really 12 and a half, and that's going to bring me to 12:39 p.m. for the next high tide. Notice 12:14 to 12:39, that is a difference of 12 hours and 25 minutes. Okay, so keep going. 12:39 plus 6 hours and 12 minutes is going to give me 6:51 p.m. for the time of my second low tide. And I just keep going. 6:51 p.m., I add 6 hours and 13 minutes to get to 1:04 a.m. on August 20th. I add 6 hours and 12 and a half minutes again to get to 7:17 a.m. Okay? And then this is where you're going to prove that you're listening and following along. 7:17 a.m., adding 6 hours, 12 minutes, is going to get you the next high tide time, which is 1 hour, sorry, not 1 hour, but 1:29 p.m. in the afternoon. So 1:29 p.m., and then I take 1:29 p.m., add the 6 and a half, I come up with 7:42 p.m. Okay? I take 7:42 p.m. and I add 6 hours, 12 and a half minutes, and I come up with 1:54 a.m. Add 6 hours, 12 and a half minutes, 8:07 a.m. Okay, so this should be, I'm sorry, I don't know if I said p.m. or a.m., but the first high tide on August 21st is 1:54 a.m., 1:54 in the morning. Then 8:07 in the morning, a.m. Okay, and then another 6 hours, 12 and a half minutes go by, and you're at 2:19 p.m., so 2:19 in the afternoon. And then the final low tide for your chart, you add 2:19 and 6 hours, 12 and a half minutes, and you come up with 8:32 p.m. Okay, so make sure that you've got those numbers filled in and that you remember that from one high tide to the next is 12 hours and 25 minutes. Okay, so from here to here, 12 hours, 25 minutes. And from low tide, that's not your bell, 12 hours and 25 minutes as well, from low tide to low tide. Okay, so make sure that you have followed along and that you have filled in the rest of that chart.